So welcome everybody to the latest in our Kickstart webinar series. Today we have got Stuart Falconer with us. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Stuart will be discussing managing sickness absence. Stuart's a HR consultant who has got over 20 years experience in a variety of sectors, and he's worked for the last 10 years providing HR advice and guidance to small and medium-sized enterprises. Stuart likes to say that if you line 10 strangers up in a room and ask them what HR means to them, you're actually going to get 10 different responses. And Stuart will advise his clients on how best to use human resources to support the specific needs of your business. I'm Jenny. I'm sitting in for Mark Rasher, who runs the Kickstart Gateway Sport and Activity Professionals. We are a managing gateway for the Kickstart scheme, which means we are supporting employers and young people I should say supporting employers to get young people into work using 6-month government funded training programs, which allow the employers to train the young people in a variety of workplace skills. We also offer them employability training as well. So without further ado, we will hand over to Stuart, who will start the presentation. Thank you, Stuart.
Thanks, Jenny. So hi, everyone. So I thought it would be useful maybe to give a bit of a background to my career in human resources. I started primarily in the public sector with the NHS in it'll be 2000 now. I spent 5 years in the NHS. That was a fantastic insight into the world of bureaucracy, process and procedures. I've also spent some time working in the private sector, primarily for companies like Howders Joinery, Whitbreads, just to name a couple. And I also spent some time in the charity sector as well. The reason why I share that with you is that, as Jenny said, I think people have very conflicting views about what HR actually is based on their own experiences. And I can tell you as well, from having worked in those different sectors as well, there are very different attitudes towards how HR operates in those businesses as well. And luckily enough, when I've started working in the small medium enterprise market, I can see how the skills that I've learned in those different industries can be transferred into the business world of small businesses. So it's useful because I like to use case studies throughout the presentation to sort of illustrate the points I'd like to make. But I also encourage all of you guys as well, if you have questions, just don't be shy, ask away, maybe put them in chat. Jenny, you'll pick up any questions in the chat, would you? Yeah, and then we can crack on and learn something as we go along. So I wanted to start off with really in fact, the second slide, the next slide I've got here. Where is it here? Oh, I've lost it now. There we go, there it is there. 118.6 million working days were lost due to sickness or injury in the UK in 2020. That's like an astronomical figure. I can hear an echo. Can anyone else hear the echo?
Yeah.
Okay, that's better. So if you think about that figure there, 118.6 million working days were lost due to sickness or injury in the UK in 2020. And that averages out at 3.6 days lost per worker. I mean, that's excessive. That is incredible. In my 20 years in HR, I can tell you that the most common query I get is around sickness absence. How do I manage a member of staff who's been off sick? And you might be, you might recognize some of these comments. It's not uncommon for people to phone in to say I'm not coming in, or they text in to say I'm not coming in. And actually, I just wanted to start on that very point. If someone texts to say they're not coming in, or if they email to say they're not coming in, what actually does that mean? What it means is they're actually avoiding having a conversation with you. Now, why would they avoid you having a conversation with them? Well, you can work that out for yourselves, right? They're avoiding it because they don't want to have to explain why they're not coming in. Why would they not want to explain why they're coming in? I'll leave that up to you to decide. But what I can tell you, that years and years ago when I worked in McDonald's, many years ago when I worked in McDonald's, I think I was 17 at the time, and if I didn't want to go into work one day, I'd get my mum to phone up. I'm not proud to admit that. That was over 30 years ago. But why would I ask my mum to phone up? Because it avoided me having to phone up to the manager and say I'm not coming in last night. Because what would happen then is the manager would challenge me and say, well, why aren't you coming in? And I think that's the one thing that employers need to understand, that when you're managing sickness absence, you can't make any decisions, you can't support people, you can't do anything really without getting a real detailed understanding of the reasons why someone is not coming in. Now, there tends to be three types of absences that people, let me just dig out a couple of the slides. So there are three types of sickness absence that I want you guys to get your heads around. There's short-term, there's intermittent and long-term. Now, short-term absences are less than 4 weeks, and reality, probably most people that are familiar with short-term take the odd day off here and there. That means you get a phone call from an employee or an email saying, oh, I can't come in today, I ate something dodgy last night, or I've got a cold, or whatever. It's a one-off day. And most employers under those circumstances are likely to think about saying, okay, no worries, I'll see you tomorrow. It's only one day, that's no big issue, I'll see you tomorrow. Now, is that acceptable? Is that an appropriate way to handle someone phoning in sick? I would say not, hence the reason why we're doing this webinar. The reason why it's not appropriate is that you're not holding that staff member accountable for explaining why they're not coming in and finding out what they're doing to ensure that they're going to be fit to come to work the next day. And like I said, most employers will accept someone saying, I can't come in today because I don't feel very well. But what happens if that person doesn't come in, say, 3 or 4 times over the next couple of weeks and uses a similar excuse each time? I can't come in today because I've got a cold. And then a week later, I can't come in today because I've got food poisoning. Or I can't come in today because I've got the flu. All of a sudden, that adds up, right? So now someone's had 3 or 4 absences in a few weeks. Well, that could equate quite easily to more than 2 or 3 weeks over the course of a year. So that short-term absence, those short-term absences will now have a significant impact on the ability of the business to run its business if someone has that amount of absence. So the reason why I mention all that is you must encourage your staff to phone their manager, to speak to their manager, to explain why they're not coming in. And then the next part of the process is to do the return to work interview. And for those of you who aren't familiar with it, I'm going to assume that everybody on the course doesn't know much about sickness absence. So forgive me if I'm telling you things you already know. A return to work interview is a form that you would complete with an employee when they return to work after a period of absence. And you document, how are you? You've been off for a while, whether it be a day. Let's talk about it. How do you feel now? Are you fit to return and job done? And that document will get filed in their personal file. One of those for an employee is no biggie. But if it's 2 of those, 3 of those, 4 of those, more than that, if you've now got 4 return to work interview forms because someone has had 4 individual days off, you've now got evidence. And now you can meet the member of staff and ask them, why do they think these absences are occurring? And what would be the impact of the business if that pattern of behaviour or pattern of absences continued? Because the employee, and I'll tell you now what they're going to say, they're going to tell you, but I was genuinely ill. I couldn't come into work because I was genuinely ill. And they'd be right, wouldn't they? I was ill, I can't come into work. You can't challenge them in the sense that you don't know whether they're ill or not. They're telling you they're ill. You take that at face value. But now you've got 4 return to work interview forms. So what you would do is say, well, look, you've had 4 individual days. I'm sure they're all genuine. But surely you can understand, Mr. Employee, that if you continue to have this amount of short-term absences over the course of a year, that's going to be quite excessive. So what I would suggest that you do is just go and see your GP, make reference to the fact you've had 4 individual days off for all these different reasons, and just ask the GP if there's anything connecting those absences together. Because it's entirely plausible, right, that maybe you have an underlying health condition, maybe you have an autoimmune condition that's affecting your wellness, and therefore maybe that could contribute to the fact you've had 4 or 5 individual days off sick. Okay, so the employee's not going to argue that, are they? Because that sounds like quite a reasonable request to make. Yes, I have been off for 4 or 5 days. Yeah, I get that. Yes, I can also understand that if I continue to have that absence pattern over the course of a year, that's going to be quite excessive. So yes, I can think it's quite a reasonable request for my employer to ask me to go and see the GP, and then the GP will tell me um, whether there's an underlying health condition or not. So let's break it down and let's work through that scenario. So the doctor's going to say one of two things. He's either going to say, yes, there is something connecting your absences together. You have X condition and that's affecting your ability to come to work. But luckily, now we've diagnosed it. Now we've got a treatment plan in place. Now we've got a prognosis for recovery, because now we know how to treat your condition. The employee will therefore be available and ready to come back to work, assuming they follow the advice of their GP. Does that make sense? Jenny, does that make sense? It does. But what happens if the GP turns around and says, well, actually, there's nothing connecting these absences together? Well, how would you work with that information? Well, now you're the employer and you can say to the employee, there's nothing connecting these absences together. I have no doubt that you were ill on those days, but what reassurance can you actually give me that you're not going to have additional days off going forward? Can you provide that reassurance? Now, nobody can provide that reassurance, can they? They can't prove it, because they didn't know they were going to take those 4 days off in the first place. And now they're taking more days off, or there's the risk of them taking more days off in the future. So now the employer has the upper hand. And now the employer says, well, you can't reassure me that you're not going to have excessive days off over the next few weeks or months. So allow me to say to you that if there are further absences in the future, then you run the risk of disciplinary action, because actually your attendance is preventing you from doing the job that we hired you to do. So just take this as an informal reminder that your responsibility is to come to work. And of course, if you're not well, then you don't come into work. But if you are ill and you're off work and it prevents you from doing your job, and that happens excessively, then we'll be entitled to take some action against that. Job done. How are they going to argue? They can't even argue against it, because that's a reasonable, rational decision. Do they honestly think that they're allowed to take as many individual days off as they wanted with no consequence whatsoever? And for those of you that have seen some of my webinars that I've done in the past, I like to use a little mantra that will help employers understand how best to manage staff in any scenario. And the mantra is expectations, accountability, and consequences. And when you break down those 3 words, they're quite straightforward. Expectations. I'm the manager, you're the employee. This is the job that I expect you to do. This is how I expect you to do it. And this is when I expect you to do it. And that includes being at work to be able to do the job that I expect you to do. And you as the employee, you have to be accountable for it. So take personal responsibility for your job that you are supposed to do. And that includes taking responsibility for your own health and your own well-being. So if the GP suggests that you need to take medication, or if you choose to, or the GP recommends that you go and see a consultant or whatever, your best bet is to follow that advice and take responsibility for following that advice. Because the consequences, the third word of the mantra is, if you don't do those things, if you don't take responsibility for the job that you're doing, and if you don't take responsibility for the management of your own health, then you run the risk of a consequence. And what would those consequences be? Well, the consequences is disciplinary action. And in the case of short-term absence, it would start off with a first written warning. For those of you that don't know, it tends to be 3 stages of the warning. You've got your first written warning, your final written warning, and dismissal. And in all the time that I've worked in HR, in over 20 years, I can tell you now, I have never dismissed anybody or advised on the dismissal of any employee who had short-term absence. Why would that be? Because they realised that they couldn't carry on taking the odd days off when they fancied it because they wanted to watch the cricket or whatever. So I've never advised on dismissing anybody for short-term absence. Yes, I've advised on first written warnings, and maybe on a couple of occasions they've continued that pattern and they've got a final written warning, but ultimately they realise that, oh my goodness, we're going down this pathway, it's inevitable at some point. If I carry on taking this time off, I'm going to lose my job. And then you'll find that their patterns improve or they leave. It doesn't matter. But you have to hold staff responsible for managing their own health. And certainly with short-term absences, because it's so, how can I put it, minor, like colds, coughs, flu, headaches, migraines. I'm not trying to belittle those illnesses because I know they can be quite severe for many people. But certainly in the case of short-term absences, you'll find that most people have the odd cold, the odd headache, food poisoning, diarrhea, that sort of thing. So hopefully that gives you a little insight in how to manage short-term absence, because short-term absence is probably the one that most people get away with because employers prefer the easy life and prefer not to have to deal with it because, oh, we'll be back tomorrow. We can cope for one day. That's fine. The other two are more interesting from a professional point of view because when you're talking about intermittent attendance and long-term absences, you've probably got you're probably dealing with someone that has a diagnosable mental health condition. And that'll be someone that's been to see the GP and they've been diagnosed with a condition. And that's a very different ball game to an extent because the employer has to be mindful that it's been diagnosed and recognize that they're not doctors. Employers are not GPs. They're not doctors. They're not able to diagnose. But what they can do is, as an employer, is to show support and understanding for the condition itself, the impact it has on the employee, and of course recognize the impact that the absences has on the ability of the employee to do the job that they're being paid to do. And this works for two reasons. Firstly, is to provide the support for an individual that has a condition. You can think of conditions like epilepsy or bad backs or multiple sclerosis, you've got cancer. You could list a whole stream of illnesses and realize that that has an impact on the individual, but equally that will also have an impact on the ability to do the job that they're being paid to do. And so it's important under those circumstances that the employer manages that employee with sensitivity and empathy. And it would start in the same way that it would do with a short-term absence. Is as soon as someone phones up to say they're not coming in, that's the trigger. That's the trigger to ask questions. Is to ask questions on why aren't you coming in? Talk me through it. And in my experience, I found that people that have genuine illnesses and genuine diagnosable injuries will be more than happy to share that information with you, as long as you show the good empathy skills. You're not doing it out of curiosity and nosiness. No, you're asking because you're a manager and you're concerned and you want to be able to support your employee. So by asking simple questions around, well, talk to me about your epilepsy or talk to me about your cancer diagnosis. How's it going to impact on you? What does it mean for now? What does it mean for the future? How do we as a company need to be able to support you? And of course, a responsible employee would engage in that conversation and talk about the treatment plan that they've been put on by their consultant or their GP. They'll talk about the medication and the impact it has on their health. They'll talk about the operation they're about to have, all the exercises they've got to do, and they'll explain all of this. And this is all the information that you would process and recognize and understand. Because again, if you think back to the mantra, you still have to hold people accountable for managing their own health. And the whole objective behind this process when it comes to managing sickness absence is to get people back at work, is to have them doing the job that they were paid to do when they were first recruited. And sometimes people have illnesses when they start jobs, and sometimes they have it when they develop these illnesses while they're in jobs. And of course, you can't predict that, but it's up to the managers to have these open conversations to try and get to the bottom of what the health condition is, the treatment plan and the prognosis for recovery. And now you can offer that support around how do we help this person back into the workplace. And I can tell you from experience that the challenges that faces is probably due to the nature of the condition and maybe the sensitivity around it. Certainly, for example, if you yourself has suffered or your family or yourself have been affected by cancer, from cancer diagnosis. I mean, I can tell you myself that both my parents died from cancer, and I'm very much mindful then that whenever I'm advising on employees that do have cancer, that I recognize the sensitivity around it, because it can be it's a horrific moment for anyone. So having that empathy and sensitivity when talking to people, and you'll find that people are quite upfront about what's going on for them as well, and their treatment plan. So even though it might be embarrassing, it might be very personal to many people. People can have some very personal conditions that affect them, but don't be shy. You have to ask these questions. You need to understand it. When I speak to my clients about how to have those conversations or what questions to ask, I paint a little picture for them. I suggest, imagine that you're a parent, and imagine your 3-year-old isn't well, and you take your 3-year-old to a GP or a consultant. Now, would you trust your 3-year-old to ask all of the relevant questions of the GP or the consultant? Would you ask them everything, or do you expect your 3-year-old to ask all the questions relevant to the diagnosis, the treatment plan, and the prognosis of recovery? The answer is no, right? You wouldn't allow or give your 3-year-old that responsibility. You would take that responsibility yourself, and you would make damn sure that you knew everything to do with that condition, because you knew that you would therefore have ultimate responsibility for managing the treatment of your child. I don't want to use that as a grim reminder of our responsibilities, but the same is true of an employer when understanding a condition, is to try and get your head around all of the nuances to do with it. Because ultimately, when you're supporting people, you need to know how to support them. How do you know how to support them if you don't know what it is you're trying to support them with? So getting that understanding is absolutely critical. Just to sort of illustrate these 2 points here, the difference between intermittent and long term. So just to be clear, intermittent would be when someone has periods of time off work, but they're spread out over the course of a year perhaps. So certainly with things like hay fever, epilepsy, you can see the examples here, and diabetes, even though someone's got a diagnosable condition, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to have a block of absence at any one time, and it could be spread throughout the whole year. So certainly with hay fever being the easiest example to use, there's a hay fever season, right? So it wouldn't be beyond the realms of possibility that someone with hay fever is going to suffer from hay fever during the hay fever season. Now that you know that, and also you have an understanding about the treatment plan that person would have, whether they just have a spray or they have pills or whatever, as long as you understand that, then you can plan for the possibility that person may well have a period of absence during the hay fever season. So even by preparing for that, and certainly like the pandemic, you might even suggest to someone they work from home. Maybe it's appropriate during the hay fever season that someone work from home to avoid the possibility of getting hay fever. That's just one example. But those intermittent illnesses is a really critical one, especially with things like diabetes, because if you know your diabetes, you'll know that there are 2 main types of diabetes, and one is a 24/7 condition. Yeah, and one with the 24/7 condition, the employee or that person has to take personal responsibility 24 hours of every day, of every week, of every year. So if they follow the guidelines as to how they manage their diabetes, then there's an expectation they should be able to work all year round, right? But having known people that have suffered from type 1 diabetes, I know for a fact that they have struggled at various times, and they're maybe a bit careless with their routines they get into. And when you're careless with the routine, then you put yourself at risk. And when you put yourself at risk, it may take you a couple of days to recover. And certainly I knew someone who had type 1 diabetes who had these, he was really in a bad place emotionally, because he was really upset with the notion that he had a condition 24/7 that was literally going to be managing him for the rest of his life, or it had a grip on him for the rest of his life. But slowly but surely, he also had to realize that this is the cards that you've been dealt with. Really sorry that's happened, but you do have, I think it's type 1, I think you do have type 1 diabetes, and therefore you've got no choice but to take responsibility for managing it, which means following the guidance from your consultant. And if you follow the guidance and stick to the routines, then there's no reason why you can't carry on working. But certainly if someone chooses not to follow the guidance from their GP, and then that leads to further absences in the future, they're running a risk of a consequence. They're running a risk of the consequence because their failure to follow the advice of their consultant, their failure to follow a routine about managing their condition, would mean they wouldn't be able to come to work at various times. And if they're not at work, that's now got an impact on the ability of the business to function properly. So there are still consequences for people that have intermittent absences throughout the year. Even though it's diagnosable and genuine, they still have to take responsibility for it. And then moving on to the last one, long-term absence. I mean, long-term absences is pretty much the same as intermittent in the sense that someone has a diagnosable condition. And the exact same conversations should take place as in all the other absences that you deal with as well, whether it's short-term or intermittent. The conversation starts on the very first day when someone says, this is the situation that I'm in. And that encourages a conversation and a dialogue, to have a conversation about the nature of the illness, the nature of the condition, the impact it has on that person. And then the employer is better equipped to know how to support that person through the management of their condition. So I hope that makes sense as a little summary of the three types of absences that you will find in your workplace. And it'd be interesting if I don't know what you guys do, but it'd be interesting if you went back to your employer and just looked at the sickness records and just got a sense for it as to whether or not the absence is excessive. One of my clients does a report from the HR software which lists all of the absences that have taken place in the last 6 months. And one of the exercises that I did was to look at each individual absence, to look at the return to work interview, to see if it was part of a plan as to how they're going to manage that individual's health or the absence record. And I think about like 75% of the cases that I read were not handled properly, and that was because someone phoned in sick, texted in sick, emailed in sick to avoid the conversation, and therefore when you do the return to work interview, you're playing catch up. I hope that makes sense. So just wanted to go back to the beginning of some of these questions, or the slides, and just explain a bit more. I mean, you can all. Does everyone get a copy of this, Jenny? All right. So you look at the first bullet point here. Employees need to know they are being managed to feel valued and to stop them taking advantage. That primarily is the short-term absences, because people, if you think about it, if you take a day off and there's no consequence whatsoever, and when I say no consequence, you don't have to explain to yourself when you text in, and then you do your return to work interview, and all they're going to say is, are you back at work now? Yeah, there's no consequence. So if there's no consequence, what's to stop them doing it again and again and again whenever they feel like it? Is because they feel that there is no consequence. So they need to know that they're being managed. They need to know that management are going to have a conversation with them about their absence, and more importantly, what are they doing to be able to to manage their absence and manage their health and be fit to return to work. And at the bottom there, you see there as well, managers need to manage, it's their responsibility. I've lost count over the years of the amount of managers that just ignore it, deny the need for those meetings, deny the need to have those conversations and the return to work interviews. Their argument will be that they're too busy, that it's only one day, it doesn't make much of a difference. But actually, hopefully now you can see that, well, was it 118 million days a year are lost to absence? And you wonder how many of those are down to individual days, and realise then again that staff will just take the mickey really and think, well, nothing happened the last time I took a day off, so I'll take a day off next week as well. And even when I worked in the hospital one year, I once got a phone call from an employee who said, could you tell me how many sick days I've got left this year? And that is true. It's nice to hear someone laughing. Thank you, Tony.
Sorry.
It's all right.
That's the public sector thing, though. That goes back to that's the public sector thing. I've been asked that an awful lot. It used to be that people thought they had 14 days, and if they hadn't used their sick, you would find that they would be really quite unwell in December.
I mean, the interesting thing about the public sector, and even now, I'm glad I'm sitting down, because when you hear it for the first time, it sounds unbelievable. So, and I was going to come to it later, but I'll do it now. Statutory sick pay is the pay that you are obliged to pay an employee if they're eligible for statutory sick pay. So if they're off for 4 days in a row, blah, blah, 28 weeks in a row, they're entitled to statutory sick pay, which is a proportion of their basic salary. Company sick pay is a scheme that will pay more than that, which will more likely compensate staff more fully for when they're sick, so they're not disadvantaged by having such a drop in their salary from their normal pay to statutory sick pay. And so the public service, or certainly the NHS when I worked there, had a specific clause in their contracts that said if you are off for for 1 year, if you've been employed for 1 year, you would be entitled to 1 week full pay. Is that right? Anyway, I can't remember the exact figures, but I can tell you that if you've been there for 5 years, if you had 5 years service in the NHS, you would be entitled to 6 months full pay and 6 months half pay. I need you to sit there and think about that for a minute. So if someone is off sick, all right, with a genuine illness, let's just say for 6 months, and they'd worked in that job for 5 years or more, they would get paid full pay for the entirety of that 6 months that they're off. And if they're off for another 6 months, they'd get half pay. You know, that's incredible. That's an incentive, if ever you've heard of one, to be off sick in the NHS, which is why managers have to be on the ball and have to be responsible for managing absences in those places. But the interesting thing is that certainly in the private sector, you may not have that level of sickness, a company sickness plans in place. What you might be more likely to find is you get an accrual of sickness absence days or company sick pay the longer you've been there. So you might say if you've been there for 2 years, you'll get 1 week, or you've been there for 5 years, you might get 2 weeks sick pay, but certainly not 6 months. Let's just agree that is slightly excessive, and it's there for a good reason, but you'd have to wonder and worry that actually that's being taken advantage of. And in my 20 odd years in HR, and I've mentioned this before, I could probably count on the fingers of one hand the amount of managers I've met who I deem to be proper, top-notch, quality managers who understand their role from top to bottom. So they understand it operationally, and they understand all the facets of HR, health and safety, IT, you name it, finance, etc., etc., etc. But if you don't ask those questions, if you don't take responsibility as a manager, and you understand all these nuances, you'll be, people run rings around you. That's a fact. This is actually the most common question that I ever get asked, ever, is can you sack someone if they're sick? And most people, when I ask that question, or when I ask that question to them, they'll say, well, no, you can't sack someone if they're ill, because that would be unfair. It's not their fault they're ill. But the reality is that it is. You are allowed to. I'm not sometimes so keen on using the word sack as opposed to terminating someone's employment. I guess maybe sack has an implication that you've done something wrong. That's maybe unfair, but certainly terminating someone's employment because they are now no longer able to do the job that you paid them to do, that is reasonable if you're able to justify the decision making behind it. And when you look at this slide here, and we've talked about it as well, provided you use the correct argument and you can demonstrate that you followed the correct steps. And the correct steps in this particular situation would be around providing a justification for why terminating someone's contract is reasonable under the circumstances. The argument would be they're no longer doing the job that I paid them to do. And more importantly, there seems no likelihood of them being able to do the job that we're paying them to do at some point. So the answer is yes, you can always terminate someone's contract provided you follow the advice from me, from Occupational Health, from the GP, about the rationale behind why it's an appropriate course of action. But we'll come to that a bit later as well. So I don't know if anybody wanted to ask any questions to me about any specific cases. Jenny, you like asking questions. Have you got any case studies off your top of your head that you can think of? Or Tony, maybe you have? Or Lydia or Emma?
Yeah, thanks. It was really a perspective, if you like, in that sometimes sickness or absence can mask something else that's going on. I'm obviously thinking from my mediator's hat, where people prefer to be away from the workplace rather than endure what's going on. So it's not a question, it was more an observation that managers, supervisors, need to try to look at a whole picture, and it reinforces the need to actually understand your staff.
I think that's an excellent point, actually, Tony, because we also have to be mindful that there are some people out there who have conditions or maybe their personal circumstances that they don't want to share. They may not feel comfortable sharing something that's of an entirely personable nature, and it's not up to us to force people to tell us something that they may not want to say. But certainly from experience, I find that as long as the employer talks with empathy and is able to have a direct conversation and be sympathetic to the challenges faced by an individual, you can find some additional solutions. But certainly during the pandemic, I know from a lot of people that were concerned about coming back to the workplace for their own health reasons. There are lots of people that have their own conditions, whether it's an autoimmune condition, who are worried about returning to the workplace under the current circumstances. And the same thing applies. You can only ask questions, and you can only work with the information you've been given back. And you'd also expect the employee to be able to explain themselves and explain why they can't do something. If you're not comfortable with the answer, you're entitled to ask. And then under those circumstances, it's more than reasonable to ask them to go to their GP and ask for a report from their GP. And that's maybe the next interesting part of managing sickness absence, I guess, is just recognizing that you're not a doctor. You can't be expected to understand the nuances of a particular condition, especially when you think about in my career, I've worked with hundreds of different illnesses and conditions some I've never heard of before. So I have to educate myself as to what these actual conditions are. But because I'm not a doctor, because I don't have that medical background, I need a medical opinion. And the first bit of medical opinion you can get is from a GP. So I'm not ignoring your point, Tony, but I guess if you follow the thread, you can realise that if you are concerned about someone's ability to attend work because they're absent, it's not unreasonable to ask their GP for a report, which would be like a letter that confirms the diagnosis, the treatment plan, and the prognosis for recovery. And then using that information, you can go back to the employee and talk about those points there and try and work out how we can support you back into the workplace, obviously dependent on what the condition is, etc. And then the other department that's worth referring to as well, which some of you may not have heard of, is occupational health, which is different from occupational therapy. So just to make the distinction here, occupational therapy is a department that will come to your workplace and make adjustments to your workplace to allow you to continue working. That's occupational therapy. You'll certainly find that with people that return home from hospital. They'll get an occupational therapist that goes around to their home and makes adjustments to the house to allow that person to continue living in their home. And that'll be things like handrails, key doors, ramps to get into the house and stuff like that, putting things accessible, seats in showers and so forth. So that's what an occupational therapist would do, and they might actually do that in the workplace as well.
We have a question from Emma as well. Emma would like to ask about employees who have a pattern on migraines, and she says that she would ask them to see their GP to find out whether it was an underlying medical condition. But is it also possible to advise them to see occupational health and to give them a target for no further absences?
We'll have to break that question down. I will answer that question. I think the issue here is two questions here. One, is it advisable to send them to their occupational health department? Absolutely. Again, we're not medical experts, and we would want to understand from occupational health, who would also need a report from the GP. Again, knowing what I do about migraines, which is not a lot, I would imagine if you think about a scale of 1 to 10, I'd imagine that people suffer migraines on a scale anywhere between 1 and 10. So I've known people that have the odd migraine now and again. I've also known people that have been quite debilitated by constant migraines. So you've got a scale of 1 to 10 then. So certainly you would want a report from the GP, which would illustrate the diagnosis, and then you'd refer to occupational health with a set of questions to ask about how we can support this person in the workplace. Now, whether that's one thing. So I'd always advise you to do that. And then obviously occupational health will provide a set of recommendations, and it'll be up to you as the employer to decide whether it was appropriate to implement those recommendations. But the second question is it appropriate to give them a target for no absences at all? That may not be the case. It may not be the case, but I guess that would be dictated by how many days off they'd had due to their migraines over the course of a period of time. Is it once a day, once a week, once a month, once every 6 months? Is it like a one-off, like an intermittent absence where they have 2 or 3 days at any particular one one particular moment. So I can't answer that question, but I'm not convinced that it would be a target to have no absences. Like I said, with intermittent conditions, it might be appropriate that you accept at some point that you're going to have some absences, but we'll do our best to try and limit them. We'll do our best to limit them, and that would be based on what the advice and recommendations that Occupational Health make, because some of those recommendations might be for the home as well. I don't know off the top of my head if migraines are diet related, or whether there are any triggers for people that have their migraines, but certainly, sorry, say again?
There can be. There can be triggers for it, which you can avoid in some cases.
Yeah, so you can see how the conversation would evolve, and if you're able to identify the fact that there are triggers to people that suffer migraines, and it could be whether it's diet related or sleep related or whatever related, then it's quite reasonable to ask the employee, are you doing these things at home? Have you taken these steps to make sure that you limit the opportunity of having migraines? I mean, I'm just making this up to an extent. Maybe alcohol could be a trigger to a migraine, and so would it be reasonable then to say to someone, well, don't drink alcohol then? The truth is, you can't make anybody do anything that they don't want to do, and if someone wants to drink alcohol, they're going to drink alcohol. But if that then has a subsequent effect on their ability to attend work because it makes them have migraines, then their absence is going to be excessive, and there's your justification for arguably terminating someone's contract because they're not following their guidance. Therefore, their pattern, they can't reassure us that their pattern isn't going to continue. Oh. Just to quickly give another example on that, was a guy I advised on once who had an ankle problem, and he was off for about 3 weeks, and when we spoke to him about it, he said that he had an ankle injury he'd picked up playing football, and he said it was an historic injury and it had never properly healed. He'd had an operation that wasn't a success, and so he was unfortunately unable to work because he played football and hurt his ankle again. And so I think the question we posed to him then is, well, what are you going to do about this in the future? Because if you play football again and hurt your ankle, you're going to be off work again. He said, well, I don't want to give up football. I said, yeah, but you're running the risk of losing your job then. Because if you play football and it's your choice, we can't stop you playing football. But if you play football, injure yourself, and then take time off work again, we'll be entitled to take disciplinary action because you've not followed the advice. You've not followed your own advice. You can't reassure us you're not going to get any better. So, sorry, Emma, I'm waffling on now. If you know me, you know I quite like a waffle. So, in answer to your question, definitely refer them to Occupational Health. Be as specific as you can. By all means, I'm sure, Jenny, you could pass on my details to Emma. So if you wanted some specific advice about how to set targets for someone who has migraines, I'd need to see the patterns that they've got. I'd need to see the individual case to understand the implications, the nuances of that particular case. But I can see there's a second question as well.
Yeah, you have another question about long COVID, which is quite an interesting one.
Yeah, I mean this is a tough one as well. But again, if you think about it, the needs of the business will always come first, which means that you are not obliged to just keep a job open indefinitely. If you hire someone to do a job, you are entitled to expect them to do that job. And of course, people get ill. It's unfortunate, but at the end of the day, you are entitled to take action. But you'd have to follow the same process as we've just described there. If someone has long COVID, we would want to know and understand what is the implications of that. How long have you been off with to date? You've been to see your GP. And in fact, this morning I dealt with a client of mine who had someone that had suffered from long COVID, and it had a knock-on effect on his overall well-being and his overall health, which I guess nobody could have predicted. And it prevented him from doing his job. The job that he was doing was quite physical, and he wasn't able to do that physical job because of the consequences of having long COVID. So a big part of the conversation that the employer is having with him is, in the opinion of your consultant, how long do you think it would take for you to regain, the physical limits that you needed to reach in order to be able to do the job that you were doing before? And that's how you literally have to break it down, because obviously people that suffer from long COVID are affected in different ways, dependent on their age, their autoimmune condition, other factors as well. So yeah, you just have to go through the same process, and it's not always pleasant, but ultimately, if you're a manager, you're responsible for making those decisions. and certainly with COVID, because of all the complexities to do with it, and that ranges from people that says, I don't want to come back into the workplace because I'm worried about getting it in the workplace. I want to carry on working from home because I feel safe here, or people have to isolate because they're more at risk than someone else. There are all these little nuances and vagaries about managing the illness itself that will have a knock-on effect about how you support that person in the workplace and understanding what they need. I'll give you a good example actually of one of my clients had someone so the employee, his family had gone away on holiday. And this was right at the beginning of the pandemic. And while they were away, his dad died of COVID. All right. And, he wasn't allowed to go and visit them. And he was really scared because his personal family, his wife and 2 young kids. And I think this was at a time when there was a lot of uncertainty around the illness about who would get it and how they'd get it. And, it was all up in the air. But he was frightened about catching the illness and passing it on to his family. So he refused to work. And I think, if I remember correctly, I think he might have been signed off with anxiety or depression around about being off or, worrying about going back into the workplace because of COVID. But you have to think about the argument here. We now know, right, or we know to date, is that there doesn't appear to be a cure to COVID. There doesn't appear to be a situation where there is a complete cure for COVID, which implies that we're going to have it forever and a day. And although the jabs and the precautions that we can make can limit its spread, people are still getting it now. So there is no guarantee that we will totally rid our society of COVID. So what does that then mean for him? If he is suffering from anxiety about his reluctance to return to work, does that mean that we let him stay off work until he's ready to come back to work? Or what does that actually mean? Because if there's no cure, his argument is, well, I'm just going to stay off work until there's a cure. Well, that could take never. There might never be a cure. So obviously it's not reasonable to expect him or expect the employer to support someone to stay off work for that length of time when there's no likelihood of them returning to work. But now we can start to pose questions to them, which is, well, we're adhering with our COVID guidelines. And, I don't know how many of you work in an office, but some of those precautions were like having a walkway around the office, having sanitizer points where you can sanitize your hands, making sure that the cleaners are regularly cleaning and deep cleaning the office and stuff like that. Certainly one of my clients was a garage, and in the garage you had people that were working in quite close proximity to each other, and there were staff that were concerned about the cars that were coming in, that maybe they carried the virus. So the responsibility on the employer was to ensure that all of the government guidelines were being adhered to, so they could reassure their members of staff they were not going to pick up the COVID virus as long as they followed those guidelines. So now you can start putting it back on the staff and say, well, we're doing everything that we can to ensure that you're not at risk of getting COVID in the business. And now you're holding them accountable, because at some point they're going to have to come back to work. I don't know if that answered your question, Lydia. Sorry, I digressed a little bit. But when you talk about managing sickness absence relating to long COVID symptoms, and there may not be a clear timeline, then yes, you would manage it through exactly that same process, which is referring to Occupational Health, getting a report from the GP, you get recommendations as to what the potential timeline's like, and then you can make a judgment call as to whether it's appropriate to terminate someone's contract. That might be an option. It might be an option just to reconvene, give it a few more months, see what happens. I will tell you one story of an employee who had an illness, but it was undiagnosed. The GP had referred her to all of these consultants, and none of them could actually work out what was wrong with her. There was nothing. They couldn't work it out. And so I think at one point she'd been off for 6 months, in a 6 months solid, and there was no likelihood of her a return to work at some point. But then she did come back to work and went off again, and it was like this for a couple of years, in fact. But ultimately, the management made a decision and said, look, we can't keep going on like this when there's no end in sight. And I'm really sorry, Miss Employee, and I'm really sorry that you haven't had your illness diagnosed, but we can't carry on like this, so unfortunately we're going to terminate your contract. Not pleasant, but at the end of the day, managers are paid to manage and make those decisions, even though they might not be a very pleasant one. unfortunately, that's sometimes what you've got to do. So let's just look at some of the rest of the slides. So we've done the short-term absence, asking questions. I literally cannot emphasize enough how important it is to ask the questions. Imagine you're the parent of a child in a GP surgery. What questions would you ask? You would ask the questions that you need to ask to understand every single facet of it. That's exactly what you should do when you're dealing with sickness absence cases, and find out how much they know themselves. If you're ill, if I pose this to anybody here, I'm asthmatic myself. I know my illness inside out. I know what triggers it. I know what happens if I exercise. I know I need to do deep breathing to prepare for exercise. I now know what I need to do to be able to manage my condition. And if I was an employee in the workplace, I would be able to explain that quite clearly to a manager who was asking. Here we go about the return to work interview. That should reaffirm everything that you've already asked them in their original phone call when they phoned up to say they weren't coming in. This should literally continue the conversation, and it sets your paper trail in motion. So you've now got a document that goes on their personal file. And when you don't do this, you don't get the consistency. There's the point I think that all HR tries to encourage managers to do is to follow an audit trail. And when you follow an audit trail, you're creating your case. The case is the case, which is the paperwork that you've put in place from the beginning of the concern. I can tell you now, I've also had cases of people that phone me up, or managers that phone me up and say, I've got a member of staff here, he's been off for 6 months, and we need to do something about it now. It's like, okay, well, what have you done to now? Well, we haven't done anything yet. So have you had a conversation with him about his condition? Have you spoken to his GP or had a report from the GP? Oh, no, we haven't done any of that yet. Well, what have you done then? Well, we've done nothing. So now we've got to start from the beginning, right? So what would happen if someone's been off for 6 months? We then arrange to meet him because I insist that it's important to meet with that employee to find out what's wrong with him. And then he says, oh yeah, I should be okay to return to work in a month or so. Then it's not going to be reasonable then to terminate someone's contract because, well, you waited 6 months. Why couldn't you wait another month? That would almost be an unreasonable reaction to that particular situation. So you need to put it in place for every single employee. So you create an audit trail for every member of staff. And some of it will just stay on their record forever and a day and go nowhere. But the ones that have excessive absences, you can deal with them and support them through a process, which is arguably supposedly to help them as well. I noticed there's another chat question, is there?
I think it was just...
Thank you. I just wanted to go back to occupational health to an extent and just revisit a particular conversation here, or a particular part of the process. I mentioned it before, where occupational health will make recommendations. And part of the reason why they make recommendations is that wherever possible, we would want our staff to be able to work. And when someone has a condition, whether it's short-term or long-term, it's entirely possible they could carry on working if adjustments are made to their job, or amendments are made to the way they work, which allows them to carry on working without aggravating or affecting their illness or injury. So occupational health will make suggestions, and you may have heard this terminology. So things like reduced duties, is that a familiar one with people? Working hours, changing the working days. Certainly with people that are returning to work after a long-term absence, it would be advisable that occupational health be contacted and said, look, how do we support this employee? And they'll say, well, actually, when they return to work, maybe you would want to put them on, maybe every other day for the first couple of weeks, or maybe just do afternoons to start with, just to build up the bit of momentum. Don't put them straight back into the deep end from day one. Let's start slowly, and then in time, we'll build up those days so that eventually they're back to doing their full-time working hours in maybe 6 weeks' time. That's what's called a graduated return. That's it. That's the phrase I was thinking of. That's a graduated return that supports that person back into the workplace. And that graduated return can come in so many different formats. So certainly when I worked in the hospital years ago, you'd have a lot of nurses that had back problems because of the amount of physical lifting that they had to do. It wasn't uncommon for a nurse to be referred to occupational health But if you think about it from a logical point of view, if a nurse can't lift, can they actually carry on working? Well, yes, they can, as long as we can take steps to ensure that that part of their job is done by someone else. So in that case, it wasn't uncommon for a lot of the other nurses on the ward to be given the responsibility for doing all the heavy lifting. And that nurse was given the freedom not to do the heavy lifting and carry on doing the rest of her job. That meant that she was still working, rather than being signed off sick and staying at home watching Jeremy Kyle or whatever. Actually, you can get people back into the workplace by asking those questions of occupational health. And occupational health will make an assessment based on the job, based on the GP report, the referral from the employer, which will list the questions they want to have answered. Questions like, this person is a nurse, they do lifting every day. This is the GP report that actually diagnoses what's the problem with the back. And if you think about back, it could be slip disc, it could be just a trapped nerve, it could be, wear and tear, you name it. It could be any number of reasons for a back problem. And then occupational health will make some suggestions and say, well, is it possible that they don't do any lifting for the next 6 weeks while they continue with their treatment plan that the GP has provided them, which is physiotherapy or, swimming, whatever. These are some of the treatment plans that the GPs suggested that will hopefully improve their ability, improve their back. And therefore the occupational health report confirms, yep, they're on a treatment plan for 6 weeks. During that 6 weeks, why don't you prevent them from lifting for now? Then you meet with them, you document that meeting, there's your audit trail. Wow, I'm just waffling on, aren't I? Right, let's see what else there. The Bradford Factor, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Bradford Factor. I don't want you to get too caught up in this, it's just it's a technical term. The reason why that's there, and I just want to go back to the hospital. So when I worked in the public sector in the hospital, they had their sickness absence policy, and the sickness absence policy identified when a formal meeting should be convened when there was a concern about someone's excessive absence, either short-term, intermittent or long-term. So like I said, if someone's off for one day, they phone in sick, you do a back to work interview, job done. But if it became a concern, and you as a company should determine what would deem to be a concern, especially with short-term absence, would it be three days in 2 months, 3 days in a month? But have these little triggers that are in mind, so that if someone goes over that trigger, you conduct a meeting with them and you sit down and you lay out the expectations is, we're concerned about your absence, you need to do something about it, take responsibility for it, otherwise there'll be a consequence. That's what should happen with the trigger thing. But that can't apply in the same way when you have a combination of full-time and part-time working staff. So if the trigger level for a meeting in the NHS is 3 individual days, right, in a month, for example, what happens if you have an employee that only works 1 day a month? And the trigger says 3 days in a month. Well, they're never going to have a meeting, right? They're never going to turn up at all. So the Bradford Factor is a weighting mechanism that applies weighting to absences, which takes into consideration their working patterns and the hours that they are working. And you'd still set a trigger level. So for argument's sake, let's just assume that, what's the word I'm thinking of? A factor is applied to an individual absence. So it could be 2 points for an absence, for argument's sake. And you might say, look, the Bradford Factor that we're going to use as a trigger is 6 points. So as soon as someone's hit 6 points, that triggers the need for us as management to hold a formal meeting with that person to make them aware that we are unhappy with the level of absence that they've got. So that's a Bradford Factor. You might have it in your organisation, you might not, but if you have a sickness absence policy, at some point you will need a trigger for a formal meeting. Certainly with the long-term absences, it tends to be 4 weeks. Intermittent absences, it's entirely up to you. It could be 3 episodes in 6 months. You could argue that's a reasonable trigger. And with short-term absences, it's entirely up to you. Some people say it's got to be, like 3 days in a month, or 2 days in a month could be deemed to be excessive. Because if someone has 2 days off in 1 month, that works out 12 days a year, right? So 12 days a year, that's an extra 2 weeks that someone's going to be off work. That's excessive. So every company should identify what would be an appropriate trigger for a formal meeting. Right, take a breath, Stu. When does an employee require a fit note from their GP? So just to clarify, 6 certificates. So A number of years ago, these certificates were changed a little bit, but the reality is that an employee can self-certify if they're off for 7 days or less. So if they're off for 7 days or less, they do not need to go and see their GP. And instead what happens is that when they come back to work and you do your return to work interview, there's a bit on the back which is about a self, I can't remember what it's called, a self-assessment. So it's a double-sided document that basically is them signing to say they were off sick. And the other side is about the notes that the manager makes about the reason for them being sick. When someone's off for 7 days or more, they are obliged to go to their GP and get a fit certificate, get a certificate from their GP that confirms that they're off sick for a period of time, and it will have the diagnosis as well. That's an important document that you need. And without it, in theory, they shouldn't really be paid, because that would be unauthorised absence. If they haven't got an absence that's been documented somewhere and you need that certificate to prove it, then that would be unauthorised absence. So you are entitled to ask them for a fit certificate if they're off for 7 days or more. Sometimes...
Sorry, what should you do if they just won't give you the fit note? If you've asked for it like 3 or 4 times and you've not been given it?
That's then unauthorised absence. They're now unauthorised absence is a disciplinary sanction. That you could just terminate their contract for gross misconduct, because actually they're not. There's when you think about someone, I don't know if you have an attendance sheet, and what you could have for attendance sheet, you could have someone that's at work, you could have someone that's sick, you could have someone who's on maternity leave, you could have someone who's on paternity leave, compassionate leave, carers leave. There's always different types of leave that people can have. But you wouldn't allow someone to go on maternity leave without a MAP-B1 form. People don't just say, "Oh, I'm pregnant, therefore I'm not going to come in." They've got to provide evidence that they're pregnant, and so they would get a MAP-B1 form from their GP, and therefore that would be their entitlement to go on maternity leave. And it's the same with sick leave as well. If you don't provide a sick certificate, and you're supposed to, and you're off work as well, that's now unauthorised. You are not authorised to be off work, and therefore you can take disciplinary action. But I think you'll find they'll quite happily go and give you a certificate after that. I noticed another couple of things in the chat. Am I just... Okay, Lydia. Right, let's just crack on with some of the slides then and see. Yeah, see at the bottom there, just to finish off with your point, Jenny, if they don't obtain one, they need to give you one. Give you a reason why, sorry. And don't be afraid to ask. Just managers need to take responsibility for asking those questions.
Thank you.
Right, let's move on. Let's clear that. So can you ask an employee to see a doctor? Yes, we talked about that before. It's entirely appropriate to ask people, because you know, flip it on its head. Flip it on its head and think to yourself, well, if the answer was no, what would happen? Well, an employee could provide no reassurance he's going to be able to come back to work, or he couldn't even tell you why he was sick. He couldn't tell you when he's likely to return to work. And if someone can't tell you when they're likely to return to work, you're entitled to take disciplinary action. It's interesting here where it says the employee is responsible for following that treatment plan. I'm really interested, especially when it comes to topics like mental health. I think I've got a couple of slides later on mental health, but I think maybe this is a good opportunity to talk about mental health, because I think it's one of those areas now that is still a little bit of a new subject that people are sort of coming to terms with. When you look at LinkedIn and you look at some of the articles you read in papers these days, mental health is a big issue these days, and I'm still not convinced that everybody understands all of the nuances to do with it. But mental health should be challenged or dealt with in exactly the same way that a physical health condition should be. Even though it's invisible, even though you can't see it, you are still entitled to ask the same questions, and people are still entitled to be able to explain. I say entitled, they still have a responsibility to understand mental health and the impact it has on them. Let me give you an example. It's easier to give examples, but I dealt with a member of staff once that, you know, he'd been off work with depression for about 6 months. I'm not knocking anybody that's got depression. I really not. It can be a diagnosable mental health condition, and people can suffer greatly from it, and it can even leave people with suicidal tendencies, and in some cases it can lead to people taking their own lives. So this is in no stretch of the way belittling anybody that suffers from mental health illness like depression. This guy had depression, signed off for six months, and then he came back to work, and then he went off sick again. And believe it or not, I had nothing to do with his absence when he was off the first 6 months. The employer just decided to let him sit it out at home, and then he came back to work, and within about 2 or 3 weeks he was off sick again with depression. So they asked for my advice, and I met with the guy and talked about, well, when did you first realise you had depression? What did the GP say? What did he suggest, recommend, blah, blah, blah. Talk me through how you've arrived at this point here today. And he gave quite a sad story. You know, he'd had some difficulties in his personal life. They'd affected his ability to attend work. He got himself on a bit of a downward spiral. He became addicted to some substances. But I said, you know, what made you come back to work? He goes, well, the GP provided antidepressants and counselling. I said, oh, that's great. And so, well, what's happening now then? He said, I didn't want to, I stopped taking the antidepressants because I was feeling better. And I didn't attend the counselling because I'm not going to sit on a couch and tell a stranger my problems. Now, you hear that statement, you think, okay, what that basically means is that you are not following the advice of your GP. He went, no, I'm not. And I said, well, you know, that's your right. That's your entitlement. I can't make you go and see your GP. I can't make you take the medication. I can't make you have counselling. I can't make you do anything you don't want to do. But by you not following his advice, what you're actually saying is that you're going to deal with it yourself, that you're taking responsibility for managing your own mental health, and that you've got a plan in place for managing it accordingly. And at that point, I said, what are you doing about it? And he said, well, nothing. He basically admitted that he was doing nothing. He hadn't done anything to improve his well-being, and was suffering as a result. And so in that particular case, it was a reminder to him, and he actually started crying after that. And the reason why I was crying is that he realised that he had stopped the thing that was making him better. And so when it comes to mental health conditions, you are equally as entitled to ask people about their mental health condition, about how it's affecting them. And certainly you shouldn't shy away from conversations, even though they're going to be very, very difficult. And certainly in my line of work, I've often had to have conversations with employers and employees who are at risk of suicide, who on some occasions have tried to take their own lives. And that could be quite a difficult conversation to have, especially if you're a manager that has had no previous experience on that topic. How are you expected to have that conversation when you are not educated yourself on that? What's the answer to that? Educate yourself. Part of your personal development, I would suggest, is to educate yourself about mental health in the same way that you'd educate yourself about an employee's physical health condition. You'd ask the questions relative to it, whether it's cancer. Yes, you've got cancer. I'm really sorry to hear that. What cancer is it? What has been diagnosed? What's the treatment plan? Is it a terminal illness? Is there a life expectancy? How long do you expect to work for? How long do you want to work for? If you're going to have a treatment and there is a recovery, is there going to be a treatment, a recovery timeline to your illness as well? So you'll have the operation, then you're off work. How long will it take for you to have that operation, the recovery? How long will it take? All of these questions are reasonable. And the same with mental health. I'm sorry to hear you're suffering from mental health. How has it affected you? What did you do about it? How have you felt since? What steps are you taking? Have you considered well-being, your well-being? Have you considered meditation? Have you considered these things? Are these things that you might want to speak to someone else about? But ultimately, you are responsible for managing your own health. So whether it's cancer, diabetes, or your own mental health, stress, flus, hay fever, whatever it is, you're the employee. You have to take responsibility for managing your own condition. And 99 times out of 100, that will mean following the advice of your GP. Right. Not even sure how many slides we've got left. There's the occupational health bits. Okay, I like my case studies now. This is an interesting case study, but it illustrates the process that you go through through managing a sickness absence case, because it will actually probably describe all of the different journeys, and there's a reason why, as I explain. So I advised an employer once about an employee who had a shoulder problem, and part of her job role was to clean. She wasn't a cleaner per se, she was working in a pharmacy department, but part of her job involved actually reaching into a cupboard and cleaning. And she said that she couldn't do it because of a shoulder problem that she had that had been diagnosed and blah, blah, blah. And so what did we do? We referred her to Occupational Health. We explained the shoulder problem. Occupational Health contacted the GP, got a report on what it was, the treatment plan, the prognosis for recovery, and the treatment plan said if you follow the stretches or the exercises or whatever, eventually you will gain full use of your shoulder again. So if you follow the plan, you'll do this. But it became quite clear early doors that this woman didn't want to clean the cupboard. She didn't like that part of the job. She liked all the other parts of the job, but this one particular part of the job she just didn't like. And so she used her shoulder as an excuse or as an excuse for not to have to clean in the cupboard. Referred to Occupational Health, and Occupational Health said, well, she's got the exercises, so we recommend for a period of time she doesn't clean in the cupboard. So she's not going to clean in the cupboard, and therefore what we're going to do is provide someone else that will temporarily clean in the cupboard while you do your exercises, so that at some point in the future, I think 6 weeks time, you will be able to do cleaning the cupboard again. And as we sort of kept on meeting with her, and she kept saying she couldn't do it, she couldn't reach into the cupboard, she didn't want to reach into the cupboard. So we realised at this point that she just didn't want to go back into that job, but we felt like she might be able to clean the cupboard, but we can't make her clean the cupboard. So instead what we did is we found an alternative job for her. It was an alternative job in another part of the hospital, and we said, okay, we appreciate the fact that you can't reach into the cupboard, that it's still aggravated, so we've got another job for you way over here, doing a different job elsewhere, and that would be a reasonable transfer or redeployment of someone from one job to another job, because they can't do the job they're being paid to do. The cover was only temporarily just to help her out for a short period of time. It was never going to be permanent. So we'll find you another job, move her over here. Guess what? Within days, she was back in her old job cleaning the cupboard, because we held her accountable. And she eventually realised that, you know, we weren't going to budge back to her original job, and she started to clean the cupboard. Is that a good example? Probably not. COVID-19 we've covered across. Disability is quite an interesting topic here. For those of you that are unfamiliar, protected characteristics is a term that refers to discrimination. So when you think about the Equality Act, there are a number of protected characteristics that you will be familiar of. So sex, race, age, disability, sexual orientation, being pregnant, transgender or gender reassignment. There are a couple of others as well that I've forgotten off the top of my head. Those are deemed to be protective characteristics. And so therefore the one we're dealing with would be the disability. So some people can be classed as being disabled. Now, what is the definition of disability? They have a physical, mental impairment that has a substantial and long-term negative impact on their ability to do normal daily activities. And the qualifying period is 12 months. So if someone has a condition that affects their ability to do normal daily activities substantially, then they'd be deemed to have a disability. So that's another reason why you must refer someone to Occupational Health and get that confirmed, that they are actually deemed to be disabled. It would be helpful in anything that you do, in any case, that you have that as part of the audit trail. So it proves that you've taken the steps to establish what the disability is, and it proves that you've taken it into consideration, as opposed to ignoring it. So I hope that makes sense. How much longer have we got? I think we've done a bit of mental health, haven't we? I'm really mindful that I haven't actually gone through the slides, but hey. Medical suspension is something that comes up occasionally. Not often, but it does come up occasionally. In fact, it happened to me earlier this year where I've got two examples. I'll give you one example. It goes back to the hospital, and there was a member of staff that worked in the pharmacy department, and his job was to measure medication for patients. And while doing it, the manager looked at him and noticed that for a few seconds, he was completely in a daze, in a zone. He was zoned out. He had literally stopped concentrating and was staring into the distance and appeared to be in some sort of trance for about 5 or 10 seconds. And the manager felt like that was a real concern, because he's measuring medication, which is a critical job, because you're measuring patients' medication that has an impact on their well-being. So if you make an incorrect measurement, you could kill someone. So she had to say to him, "I've got to stop what you're doing right there. I can't have you working while you're doing that. So I'm going to refer you to Occupational Health to assess whether there's a medical reason for why you zoned out like that." And he was suspended on medical suspension, which means that he was taken out of his job. He was told to go off on sick leave, and he was told to go to see Occupational Health. When he turned up at Occupational Health, they asked him, "Do you know why you're here?" And he said, "I have absolutely no idea why I'm here." He had no recollection of zoning out whatsoever. So the occupational health person requested to contact his GP, and the GP then wrote a report saying that he had a history of mental health illness at various times, and that the stress of the job, because he was being managed by his manager about the need for accuracy, he was being held accountable for his job, and the stress aggravated his mental health condition, which meant that he had zoned out or had whether you call it a panic attack or a seizure, whatever. But in that moment in time, he was vulnerable to that condition. So that's why, one of the circumstances that you could medically suspend someone if you feel like someone's health is affecting their ability to do their job, or they put other people at risk, etc., etc. Statutory sick pay we've covered. Company sick pay we've covered. Key points to remember: any absence triggers a discussion. Ask questions and be proactive. Don't react to it. Be proactive. Be ready to ask questions from the moment someone phones up sick. Have an idea about the script that you're going to follow. "Thank you for phoning up. Let's talk about this. What's happened here? Have you been to see have you been to the pharmacy? You say you got diarrhea. Have you been to the doctors to get some Imodium or something? What steps are you taking to improve your health?" So speak face to face or on the telephone with employees. Conduct a return to work every single time, and you create an audit trail. That's it. Job done. Questions? Is that a tumbleweed moment? Yeah.
How would you handle someone with long-term sickness in the workplace? I mean, where they refuse to, it's not so much a sickness absence, but how would you handle someone that you knew had a long-term health condition, which you knew was impacting on their ability to do the job, like your person in the pharmacy, but unlike them in a role where they can't create a dangerous situation particularly, but a member of staff, you know, they're unwell, but they won't admit it. They won't allow their manager to understand what then
if they're underperforming in the role, you're going to manage them their underperformance. All you can do is manage the fact that they're not doing the job that you wanted them to do. If they choose not to tell you the reasons why they're not doing the job, then you can't do anything about that. For argument's sake, they could say they're being bullied, right? Or they're being bullied by someone else, and that might affect their ability to do the job. If they don't tell you they're being bullied, you can't do anything about it. So you have to encourage people to say what it is. Otherwise, you only manage a situation based on its merits. And in that particular case, if someone's got an illness and they're not telling you about it, and you know it's affecting their ability to work, and you can see that in the results that they're in the performance and the results that they're providing, then you manage their performance and say your performance is lacking. This is what I expect you to do. You need to take personal responsibility for it, but there's going to be a consequence if you don't do it. And they've got a choice then, right? Do I tell my manager or not? But that applies to every part of the management, the employer-employee relationship. In the same way that if you suffer a bereavement at home, and then come to work the next day, it's going to affect you. It's theoretically it's going to be on your mind. You're dealing with the loss of someone, so it would be reasonable to say something. If your performance is being affected by a death of a loved one in the workplace, then you should tell someone. And if you don't, why would you be surprised that managers pick you up on it and say you're not performing to the level that you should be? So performance manager would be the option under those circumstances, I'm afraid.
Thank you. What about a situation where people go off sick and you think that they're not they're going off sick to mask something else? Sickness absence is a more acceptable explanation for their absence than real reason.
It may well be, but you know, the reality is the same, is that you can only go by the information that you have at your disposal. You can only ask people, and you can only go by what they tell you. I was going to say, the beauty of that sounds terrible, doesn't it? But the thing about the short-term absences and things like that, when you're managing it, is if you think about it, what would happen if someone was to lie? Yeah, what would happen if someone was to lie? You're still following the same process. You're still looking at it through the eyes of someone who has excessive absence, right? So you're still going to go through the same process. They're still going to come up with an explanation, and you're still going to agree the outcomes at the end of the meeting anyway. And whenever you have these meetings, the outcome you're looking for every day of the week is you will return to work at some point. We're expecting you to return to work when your absence ends. Regardless of what you tell me the reason for your absence is, I still expect you back at work. So if you're lying about your absence, it's going to come out in the wash sooner or later. I mean, you could lie on one, you could take one day off and lie about it, and maybe no one will be any the wiser. But as soon as you get a pattern of absences, or 2 or 3, you've now got a paper trail that you can now confront someone and say, well, maybe you should go and see your GP, because it would appear that you've got excessive absence. Maybe there's something linking these things together.
Do you think there's any benefit in looking at sickness patterns, not in terms of sickness absence for individuals, but looking at sickness absence patterns across sections or departments to identify why there is a excessive sickness absence in department A and not in department B when they're doing the same job?
Yes.
Does that then raise a red flag as to whether there might be somebody that's causing people to not want to be in the workplace, such as a bully or an unpleasant working environment or toxic activity?
Absolutely. You still have to be mindful, though, that people make choices, decisions, and ultimately we can only go with the information that we have at our disposal. But you'll find with a lot of the sickness absence reporting procedures that you find in workplaces, which is either going to be an Excel spreadsheet or it might be a piece of HR software, when you allocate an illness to someone, you have a drop-down menu of the different reasons for those absences. So you might have bad back, you might have, breathing difficulties, you might have mental health, and you get all of these categories that you might have as a reason for why someone is off sick. Then when you run your report on a monthly, bi-monthly, fortnightly, quarterly time, you will see all of the absences over a period of time, and then you can filter it by department. So if you found that in one department there was, my goodness, 8 people have been off with mental health challenges over the last 3 months or so, just as an example, you'd ask the manager and say, or try and establish whether there is any pattern between those 8 people. Is there anything connecting those? And certainly, I'll go back to the hospital again, and this was a true story, is that every department had to fill in these returns, which listed all the members of staff with the days they were off and the reason for the illness. And it became apparent after a while, because someone identified the fact that all of these people were off with breathing difficulties, but none of them had asthma, none of them were diagnosed with asthma or anything else. And what it turned out was that there was a leak in the storeroom, and there was like a cleaning material or something that had a leak in it, and it sort of affected the area within which they were working. So yes, yes is the short answer to your question. And yeah, you just have to ask relevant questions. So thank you for asking.
Have we got anybody else wanting to ask questions?
There's a no.
That would seem to be a no. So with that in mind then, Stuart, can I just thank you so much for a really, really instructive and helpful webinar. I very much enjoyed listening to. I've learned loads, and I'm sure everybody else has too. So thank you very much indeed.
You're welcome. Take care.
Thank you.